And Mrs. Bunting, that I am a man of science. I make, that is, all sorts of experiments, and I often require the presence of great heat." He shot out a hand, which she noticed shook a little, towards the stove. "This too will be useful, exceedingly useful to me," and he touched the edge of the stone sink with a lingering, caressing touch. He threw his head back and passed his hand over his high, bare forehead. Then, moving towards a chair, he sat down, wearily. "I'm tired," he muttered in a low voice. "Tired, tired. I've been walking about all day, Mrs. Bunting, and I could find nothing to sit down upon. They do not put benches for tired men in the London streets. They do so on the Continent. In some ways they are far more humane on the Continent than they are in England, Mrs. Bunting." "Indeed, sir," she said civilly, and then, after a nervous glance, she asked the question of which the answer would mean so much to her. "Then you mean to take my rooms, sir?" "This room, certainly," he said, looking round. "This room is exactly what I have been looking for, and longing for, the last few days." And then hastily he added, "I mean this kind of place is what I have always wanted to possess, Mrs. Bunting. You would be surprised if you knew how difficult it is to get anything of the sort. But now my weary search has ended, and that is a relief, a very, very great relief to me." He stood up and looked round him with a dreamy, abstracted air. And then, "Where's my bag?" he asked suddenly, and there came a note of sharp, angry fear in his voice. He glared at the quiet woman standing before him, and for a moment Mrs. Bunting felt a tremor of fright shoot through her. It seemed a pity that Bunting was so far away, right down the house. But Mrs. Bunting was aware that eccentricity has always been a perquisite, as it were, the special luxury, of the well-born and of the well-educated. Scholars, as she well knew, are never quite like other people, and her new lodger was undoubtedly a scholar. "Surely I had a bag when I came in," he said in a scared, troubled voice. "Here it is, sir," she said soothingly, and stooping, picked it up and handed it to him. And as she did so she noticed that the bag was not at all heavy. It was evidently by no means full. He took it eagerly from her. "I beg your pardon," he muttered, "but there is something in that bag which is very precious to me, something I procured with infinite difficulty, and which I could never get again without running into great danger, Mrs. Bunting. That must be the excuse for my late agitation." "About terms, sir," she said a little timidly, returning to the subject which meant so much, so very much to her. "About terms," he echoed. And then there came a pause. "My name is Sleuth," he said suddenly. "Sleuth. Think of a hound, Mrs. Bunting, and you'll never forget my name. I can provide you with a reference." He gave her what she described to herself as a funny sideways look. "But I should prefer you to dispense with that, if you don't mind. I am quite willing to pay you, well, shall we say a month in advance?" A spot of red shot into Mrs. Bunting's cheeks. She felt sick with relief, nay, with a joy which was almost pain. She had not known till that moment how hungry she was, how eager for a good meal. "That would be all right, sir," she murmured. "And what are you going to charge me?" There had come a kindly, almost a friendly note into his voice. "With attendance, mind. I shall expect you to give me attendance, and I need hardly ask if you can cook, Mrs. Bunting?" "Oh, yes, sir," she said. "I am a plain cook. What would you say to 25 shillings a week, sir?" She looked at him deprecatingly, and as he did not answer she went on falteringly, "You see, sir, it may seem a good deal, but you would have the best of attendance and careful cooking, and my husband, sir, he would be pleased to valet you." "I shouldn't want anything of that sort done for me," said Mr. Sleuth hastily. "I prefer looking after my own clothes. I am used to waiting on myself. But, Mrs. Bunting, I have a great dislike to sharing lodgings." She interrupted eagerly, "I could let you have the use of the 2 floors for the same price—that is, until we get another lodger. I shouldn't like you to sleep in the back room up here, sir. It's such a poor little room. You could do as you say, sir. Do your work and your experiments up here, and then have your meals in the drawing room." "Yes," he said hesitatingly, "that sounds a good plan. And if I offered you £2, or 2 guineas, might I then rely on your not taking another lodger?" "Yes," she said quietly. "I'd be very glad only to have you to wait on, sir." "I suppose you have a key to the door of this room, Mrs. Bunting? I don't like to be disturbed while I'm working." He waited a moment, and then said again, rather urgently, "I suppose you have a key to this door, Mrs. Bunting?" "Oh, yes, sir, there's a key, a very nice little key. The people who lived here before had a new kind of lock put on to the door." She went over, and throwing the door open, showed him that a round disc had been fitted above the old keyhole. He nodded his head, and then, after standing silent a little, as if absorbed in thought, "42 shillings a week. Yes, that will suit me perfectly, and I'll begin now by paying my first month's rent in advance. Now, 4 times 42 shillings is—" He jerked his head back and stared at his new landlady. For the first time he smiled, a queer, wry smile. "Why, just £8, 8 shillings, Mrs. Bunting." He thrust his hand through into an inner pocket of his long, cape-like coat and took out a handful of sovereigns. Then he began putting these down in a row on the bare wooden table which stood in the centre of the room. "Here's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, £10. You'd better keep the odd change, Mrs. Bunting, for I shall want you to do some shopping for me to-morrow morning. I met with a misfortune to-day." But the new lodger did not speak as if his misfortune, whatever it was, weighed on his spirits. "Indeed, sir, I'm sorry to hear that." Mrs. Bunting's heart was going thump, thump, thump. She felt extraordinarily moved, dizzy with relief and joy. "Yes, a very great misfortune. I lost my luggage, the few things I managed to bring away with me." His voice dropped suddenly. "I shouldn't have said that," he muttered. "I was a fool to say that." Then more loudly, "Someone said to me, 'You can't go into a lodging-house without any luggage. They wouldn't take you in.' But you have taken me in, Mrs. Bunting, and I'm grateful for the kind way you have met me." He looked at her feelingly, appealingly, and Mrs. Bunting was touched. She was beginning to feel very kindly towards her new lodger. "I hope I know a gentleman when I see one," she said, with a break in her staid voice. "I shall have to see about getting some clothes to-morrow, Mrs. Bunting." Again he looked at her appealingly. "I expect you'd like to wash your hands now, sir. And would you tell me what you'd like for supper? We haven't much in the house." "Oh, anything'll do," he said hastily. "I don't want you to go out for me. It's a cold, foggy, wet night, Mrs. Bunting. If you have a little bread and butter and a cup of milk, I shall be quite satisfied." "I have a nice sausage," she said hesitatingly. It was a very nice sausage, and she had bought it that same morning for Bunting's supper. As to herself, she had been going to content herself with a little bread and cheese. But now, wonderful, almost intoxicating thought, she could send Bunting out to get anything they both liked. The 10 sovereigns lay in her hand full of comfort and good cheer. "A sausage? No, I fear that will hardly do. I never touch flesh meat," he said. "It is a long, long time since I tasted a sausage, Mrs. Bunting." "Is it indeed, sir?" She hesitated a moment, then asked stiffly, "And will you be requiring any beer or wine, sir?" A strange, wild look of lowering wrath suddenly filled Mr. Sleuth's pale face. "Certainly not. I thought I had made that quite clear, Mrs. Bunting. I had hoped to hear that you were an abstainer." "So I am, sir, lifelong. And so's Bunting been since we married." She might have said, had she been a woman given to make such confidences, that she had made Bunting abstain very quickly in their acquaintance. That he had given in about that had been the thing that first made her believe that he was sincere in all the nonsense that he talked to her in those far-away days of his courting. Glad she was now that he had taken the pledge as a younger man. But for that nothing would have kept him from the drink during the bad times they had gone through. And then, going downstairs, she showed Mr. Sleuth the nice bedroom which opened out of the drawing-room. It was a replica of Mrs. Bunting's own room just underneath, excepting that everything up here had cost just a little more, and was therefore rather better in quality. The new lodger looked round him with such a strange expression of content and peace stealing over his worn face. "A haven of rest," he muttered, and then, "He bringeth them to their desired haven." Beautiful words, Mrs. Bunting. "Yes, sir." Mrs. Bunting felt a little startled. It was the first time anyone had quoted the Bible to her for many a long day. But it seemed to set the seal, as it were, on Mr. Sleuth's respectability. What a comfort it was, too, that she had to deal with only one lodger, and that a gentleman, instead of with a married couple. Very peculiar married couples had drifted in and out of Mr. and Mrs. Bunting's lodgings, not only here in London, but at the seaside. How unlucky they had been, to be sure, Since they had come to London, not a single pair of lodgers had been even moderately respectable and kindly.